unrepresented people of color. And that unstable mix is always going to exist, and anything until there's a real change there. And nobody who's on top has the will to make that change.
Well, you mentioned I know you've been spending the last year or so in South America, and you mentioned speaking to people on the left there who still have a kind of reverence for Chavez, and carrying on the kind of Bolivarian revolution. Could you talk a little bit about that, like why Chavez and the revolution? I mean, he was elected twice, but like what he embodies, like in that country in South America as a whole, has carried on, or there's a much deeper reserve of support for it than even the sanctions or various coup attempts can topple.
Right. Yeah. Well, Bolivar was a Venezuelano, even though he was in favor of a continent-wide single country, or at least in the beginning he was. He later decided that really couldn't be practical, but he was always in favor of unity because he knew very well that there was a menace to the north, the United States, and the Latin American intelligentsia, even as it emerged from the Spanish yoke, and it was a pretty heavy yoke in the 1820s, said sooner or later we'll get free of Spain, but we're just going to have a bigger, scarier force to deal with from the north rather than from Europe. So we need as much unity as possible. And what Bolivar offered them was, in theory, an end to the racial gradation that defined Spanish occupation. And that this was a very complex gradation compared to, say, the American South, where everybody pre-war was officially either white or black. The Latin American variation had many degrees, but there was no doubt the pure white were at the top and the darkest were at the bottom. And Bolivar, in theory, offered an end to that, offered dignity in the way the Napoleonic armies offered dignity to people who'd come from very low stations in life, who could, through sheer bravery and intelligence on the battlefield, come to prominence in his new establishment. And all that is very deeply remembered. I mean, much of it came apart. I mean, Bolivar ended his days going down the sluggish, malarial Magdalena River, dying of probably malaria. Nobody even knows. By that time, he probably had every bug in the continent feasting on his wasted body, which weighed about 80 pounds at that point. But he offered the idea of dignity and of independence, of being something less than somebody else's satellite. And even now, there are a lot of people who, having seen the Spanish overlords replaced by the much more efficient North American and British overlords, because the British play a much bigger role in all this than is usually acknowledged, seeing them replaced by, let's say, the Anglo overlords, have a deep bias in favor of anyone who's willing to throw off that domination.
And, if you are, like you said, in Langley or the DC suburbs, the idea that any country in Central or Latin America or South America would exercise anything like independence or leave our sphere of influence is unthinkable. And, like if you were if you were in Langley, I remember Alexander Coburn wrote about this, that like the bane of your existence, those two words that you're always fighting against, land reform.
Yeah.
And anytime you hear any politician making any noise about land reform in Latin America, you knew they had to go. Because, in like many of these countries, what is it, like 3 or 4 families that own pretty much all of the land?
There are different numbers for each family, but it's always like the 15 families or the 12 families or the 8 families. Yeah, and a lot of this represents big wealth for a few people. We were in Asunción in Paraguay briefly, and because one of the wars that interests me really deeply is the War of the Triple Alliance, in which...
That's actually one of my favorite War Nerd episodes. A war that killed, 90% of the male population?
Of the male population of Paraguay, yeah.
And then I remember you were talking about that one, and you were like, Could you imagine being one of the 10% who lived through it and having to be like, hey guys, hi, I'm back, everybody.
yeah. Got lucky, I guess. And because when you're a kid playing war, you play with the toy soldiers until everybody on one side is dead. But in real war, that's extremely rare, and this came very close to it, which is highly, highly unusual. Well, we were in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, on the Paraná River, and it had all the look of what I would consider an oil town, and being, having been through Bakersfield on a lot of trips, I know what an oil town looks like. That is, there are incredibly expensive shopping malls. There are gigantic neon billboards everywhere, but there are no sidewalks. And you actually have to watch your step really carefully moving from one expensive mall to the next, because it's nothing but potholes. So nobody's even clear where the money in Paraguay came from. Smuggling, the incredible profits of soy now that the Asian market has opened up and has...
Now that masculinity has been destroyed in the West.
Now that masculinity has been destroyed, yeah. But there is definitely big money there, and it's definitely not filtering down. So that means Paraguay is in a perfectly good condition as far as the people in Langley and places like that are concerned. It's not in a very good condition otherwise. But what that means is very hard to say. There was a day when I was a young person, believe it or not, when revolution looked like the future for Latin America. But the ideology that backed that revolution and made it seem like an inevitable future for most of the continent is long gone. And unlike the Middle East, where in their clever way, the people at Langley and MI6 went consciously about replacing that ideology with one more to their taste, which was Wahhabism, radical Islam. And they did go about designing that as the replacement ideology.
It was consciously fomented by Saudi Arabia, but also, as you said, Langley and MI6 as a conscious counter to any kind of Arab nationalism.
Yeah,
or any country that wanted to control the resources of their own nation.
There used to be a
or
lot
have
of
any kind of pan-Arabism or anything like
yeah,
that.
There weren't a lot of Arab out-and-out communists, because religion is important in the Middle East, but there were a lot of out-and-out Arab socialists and leftists of various hues. Whereas in Latin America now, it's hard to find an ideology which can displace these oligarchies, and so it's at kind of a sad point in some ways.
Well, moving on from to Venezuela to the other major target of the U.S. state at the moment, and it's the considerably larger and more dangerous situation that we find ourselves bearing down upon, and that is Iran. And again, it's very hard to figure out just how seriously to take all of this. I mean, I take it very seriously, but it does seem like right now the biggest impediment to us starting a war with Iran is Donald Trump and his genuine lack of interest or lack of patience. And just, I think he genuinely actually doesn't want America to fight a war. He wants to look tough. He doesn't want to be humiliated. I could see him doing airstrikes or whatever. But at the same time, he put Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, and put John Bolton in charge of everything else. So you have this very weird thing where the people who are we're too crazy almost even for the Bush administration now have their fingers on the trigger, but their boss is a guy who doesn't have any of the drive or ideological fervor or commitment to regime change in Iran, which, as we've talked about on the last episode we did with you, we've returned to this many times before, is the holy grail for these neoconservative psychos.
I think part of it is because Trump is so disengaged, because he is kind of apolitical in a sense. He has instincts and he has sadism that he likes to see sated, and he has these hooting crowds of psychos that he loves to be happy to see him and to cheer him, but he doesn't have any kind of programmatic ideas. So that means that he doesn't have people on his side in any broad sense. He doesn't have a stable of wonks to carry out his will because he doesn't have a will. So instead, he's got the DC establishment, which just is this conveyor belt of people, and it's like, oh, you have an opening, here's a guy, and if you hang around long enough and you're a creep like Bolton or Pompeo, you get to pop up. And then, but they have their own agendas that are tied to more broad, neoconservative ideas. Trump has no interest in that, but he also has no interest in managing anything, in preventing them from doing what they want to do. And also, hilariously, even though he got famous on TV for saying you're fired, he hates firing people because he doesn't like personal confrontation, because he has no personal virtues. That's the thing about Trump, is that he has no virtues. Like even the virtues of an asshole, Like I'll look a man in the eye and fire him. It's like, well, that makes you a prick, but at least you have the virtue of not feeling like you're too much of a coward to confront that moment. Like he has nothing. No, he has no positive virtues. So that means that these guys just do the things, and they do them out of his purview, and then it comes to us, and he's like, wait a minute, what were you doing? Like the bombing in Iran, where they brought it to him on a platter. Let's do a limited strike on Iran. Fingers crossed that it was going to escalate something. And at the last minute, he's like, oh, this is actually this is committing me to something that I do not have anything like the stamina or will to do. So he pulled back. And so, but the thing is, he won't fire them. He won't get rid of them. So they're going to keep doing it. They're going to keep poking the fucking bear until something happens that forces Trump's hand.
Which is why this situation is, both surreal and terrifying. And like, I could easily imagine something unimaginable happening. But again, like, I just have to use this as an example of people really now who are now obsessed with Trump, and there is much that is evil and abominable about his administration, but I'm sorry, they're not even in the same galaxy as the first George W. Bush administration. Do you think that they would have let a chance to bomb Iran after some sort of ludicrous provocation like that fucking oil tanker thing? Do you think that they would let that go to pot at all? Or, I'm sorry, even a Hillary Clinton administration?
Oh, well, Hillary would have been in there with both feet.
Yeah.
I mean, I think everybody knows that. And yeah, in a way, the good thing about, as you were saying, the good thing about Trump being a total sleaze is that he has half an ear to the pulse of the sleaze normal and what the sleaze normal values above all. I don't know if people fully realize this, but I do, because I spend a lot of time on comment threads. What they want is noise. What they want is not necessarily a bunch of body bags coming home. They want noise. And Trump supplies the noise, and so far without the body bags. And that makes a lot of people happy. Obama, in his quite creepy way, was an ideal counterinsurgency leader, if there can be such a thing, because there are doubts about the whole theory of counterinsurgency and whether it will ever really work, short of genocide. But Obama was...
another word for counterinsurgency, actually. Yeah.
But Obama was about as close as you can get. A smiling brown face with experience of many different cultures, who was at home in many different cultures and killed quietly.
No noise.
When